One of the key things to keep in mind when we're talking about psychology itself is that there are a variety of vantage points from which we can look at human behavior. And this will be a theme that we will repeat over and over again. And it really is the three main levels of analysis that are key in understanding psychology itself. And the core, the thing we're going to be focusing on primarily, is going to be behavior itself. So when we look at behavior, we're wondering, how did it come to be this way? Why does this person act this particular way? What influences are really a part of explaining the person's behavior? So behavior is one of those things. The other one is what we might refer to as a mental process or mental processes. I mean, one of the aspects that has been a part of the debate about the shooter in the Aurora Theater shootings is why? Why did he do what he did? And the question a lot of times is not only about his behavior, we can work backward from the behavior and make some conclusions, or what was going on inside of him cognitively. In other words, what was he thinking, literally, that would motivate somebody to behave the way they do? So we ask the question why. We're also asking what, which is, what's the behavior itself? What's the mental process? Now, of course, with mental processes, it really depends on the person to tell us that. And like I said before, there's a certain bias that comes with examining our own mental processes. In other words, if I ask you, what were you thinking? Depending on how I ask that question, like, what were you thinking? Or tell me what you were thinking about, it will depend on really how you go about answering that question. So why, what, the how is another domain, which I'm going to put off to another time, and of course who, which are all questions that are part of, even when you're asking, doing journalism, you ask who, what, where, when, why, and how, which when is the other one, is when did these particular things happen. So all of these are part of the backdrop to the three main levels, but the key is what we're looking at here in behavior and mental process. Now the other element, and this is this is one of the three main emphases or main levels of analysis. And the first one, as you're looking at here, is analysis level 1, if you will. And when we talk about biologic, we're looking at not only adaptive traits right here, but which the natural selection has to do with evolving and evolution. How do we develop the skills that we do? For example, there are some species of animals that seem to pass on the aversion to certain kinds of plants that are aversive to them. And that's not necessarily, well, it's learned by the first person, but it seems like it's passed on through natural selection. So the animals that are the most hardy and the most ability to withstand a particular poison or a particular substance on a particular leaf or another animal, for example, those survive, the other ones don't, and that's part of the evolutionary chain, if you will, of development. The other one is just genetic predisposition, and predisposition is a pretty broad term, but how is somebody predisposed? You grow up in an alcoholic home, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a gene for alcoholism per se, but there certainly is a very strong learning curve about alcoholism and the consumption of alcohol. There are some suggestions that there's a genetic predisposition to responding to the environment in a particular way that might be part of the whole pattern of alcoholism. Actual brain mechanisms. Neuroscience is part of this, of our field, that's getting more and more attention, partly because we seem to be able to look within at a very microscopic level. So brain mechanisms that are actually firing at particular points in time, and actually hormonal influences as well. So the biological influences cannot be really underestimated in terms of their impact in this analysis. And when we're looking at overall human behavior or mental processes, biological influences are critically important, and our ability to look at them are critically important. Now, just like we were saying before, biological influences, we're looking at specifically the biology of the person. That's kind of redundant, I know, but it really is, and that's the things that are more immutable. They don't change very much. They're very much a part of the picture for hormones and biology and neuroscience and the firing of areas in the brain and so forth that are very much a part of understanding biology. We know certain things about the biology of schizophrenia, for example, that the auditory centers of the brain fire when somebody is experiencing auditory hallucinations, which makes the connection. That's a biological element. The second level of analysis is, of course, the psychological, and this is not just the domain of psychology. It's also part of the element of learning and learned fears, expectations. You can't really underestimate the power of expectations in people's minds, because it puts them in a position to see the world in a particular way. So the expectations and particular emotional responses, and how somebody actually thinks, how they process the world around them and perceive the world around them. We don't just take in data. That's the actual perception element, but the interpretation of it is also part of the backdrop, if you will, to psychological influences. So first level biology, and it's arbitrary which level it is. I mean, all three of these levels impact our understanding of behavior and mental processes. Now, obviously, the last level, and I'm just arbitrarily referring it to the third level, is sociocultural. And this one is probably the toughest to get our arms around, because it is so broad in our understanding of the sociocultural influences. I just was talking to a couple of counselors that I was supervising, and we were talking about a Hispanic family. Their understanding of family from a Hispanic point of view is very different culturally than a thoroughly Caucasian family. These things have a profound influence, but a lot of times they're background influences that we don't even pay attention to, that they're there because they're functioning in the background. They impact family expectations, how we see society and how we're supposed to behave, the peer group influences as well. All of these things are background, and unless we pay attention to them, we will miss a great amount of data in looking at the overall understanding. There are certain behaviors in one culture that we would see as very crazy, and in their culture is very normative. So the whole idea of normative, not normal, but normative, it comes into play when we talk about cultural influences. What fits in a culture is very important for us to take into account when we're talking about a particular behavior. Now, let's put these all together here and just as a larger picture, so you can understand what it is that I'm talking about in understanding the entire psychosocial, biopsychosocial approach. All right, so when we put the whole thing together, what you will see is each one of these, as the arrows suggest, each one feeds into our understanding of the behavior and the mental process. And we can't weight one over another. They all influence it. And so we have to have kind of an interacting whole that goes together here in understanding all of them. And in this area in the middle where they all interact is really part of the key in understanding how this particular behavior operates and taking it into account. So when I'm sitting down talking to somebody and I hear about their behavior, one of the things I have to ask is I have to check into each of these areas in order to understand the overall behavior itself. If I don't, let's say I don't take this one into account, then these two are important, but they're not in context. And that's essentially what this gives me, is context to understand the behavior in some area in which it occurs. If I don't take this into account, then I won't have an accurate understanding of it. This model, the biopsychosocial model, is one that we will talk about throughout the entire semester. I can't underestimate it or underemphasize it enough for you. We cannot look at any behavior without this entire context coming into play and understanding it completely. And that's why I set aside an entire video just to talk about this specifically, so you understand the importance of this particular concept.